The year 1880 had decided to bake the West into a brittle, tan husk. Summer arrived not as a season, but as a sentence, punishing the land with a relentless, white-hot sun. In the small, dusty outpost of Frontier, the heat warped the air, making the distant mesas tremble like apparitions. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything: the unpainted planks of the general store, the drooping leaves of the lone cottonwood in the town square, and the souls of the men and women who called this unforgiving corner of the world home. The Redemption River, a name that felt more like a cruel joke with each passing day, had dwindled to a sluggish, muddy trickle, its bed a graveyard of cracked earth and sun-bleached stones. Jake Thompson rode at the edge of town, his posture relaxed in the saddle of a magnificent black stallion that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. The horse, a creature of midnight silk and coiled steel, was a testament to its owner's wealth, as was the saddle, tooled with intricate silverwork, and the clean, well-kept state of Jake's denims and leather vest. He was a man of means in a land of want. His face, weathered by sun and wind, held the hard lines of a man who had seen too much. Yet his eyes, a startling, clear blue, were distant, as if fixed on a horizon no one else could see. He owned a sprawling ranch several days' ride north, a kingdom of cattle and grassland purchased with a fortune that had followed him from Colorado. He had built a similar empire there once, before the fire and the screaming and the smell of gunpowder had turned his life to ash. He had left it all behind, a past he couldn't outrun no matter how far or fast he rode. Now, money was just paper and land was just dirt. They were shields, not sustenance. They kept the world at a comfortable distance, but did nothing to fill the cavernous hollow in his chest where a family used to be. He was 32, rich, and as empty as the prairie sky. He watched the townsfolk move with the lethargic slowness the heat demanded. A blacksmith's hammer fell with a weary clang. Two women in faded calico dresses fanned themselves listlessly on a porch. Frontier was a town holding its breath, waiting for the rain that the brassy, cloudless sky refused to deliver. Jake felt a familiar detachment, the sense of being a ghost observing the living. He had no business here, other than the grim routine of resupply. He was a visitor in a life he no longer knew how to live. A few miles upstream, Sarah Mackenzie led a tired-looking mare toward the pathetic remains of the Redemption River. At 19, she possessed a quiet beauty that hadn't yet been scoured away by the harshness of the land. Her hair, the color of sun-ripened wheat, was pulled back in a practical braid, and her eyes, a soft dough brown, held a flicker of worry that had become their constant companion. Her dress, though clean, was patched at the elbow, a small flag signaling her family's losing battle against misfortune. The Double M Ranch, her family's legacy, was dying. The drought had scorched their pastures, and the failed crop had been the final blow. Her father, a proud and stubborn man, had broken his leg a month prior when a spooked horse threw him, leaving the brunt of the work on Sarah's slender shoulders. She was his only child, her mother having been taken by fever years ago. Her spirit was a tough, resilient thing, forged in hardship, but even the strongest steel can bend under constant pressure. She carried 2 large wooden buckets, their weight a familiar ache in her arms. The ranch well was nearly dry, forcing her to make this daily trek to the river for the brackish water that was barely enough to sustain them and their few remaining livestock. She looked up at the sky, a habit born of a farmer's daughter, for the first time in weeks. A strange, bruised purple line was forming on the western horizon. A storm, but it was far off, a distant promise that felt as unreliable as a politician's word. Reaching the riverbank, she sighed at the pitiful sight. She had to wade out into the middle of the wide, dry bed to reach the shallow channel of water. She set the buckets down, hitched up her skirts, and stepped onto the cracked mud. The ground was hot beneath her worn boots. As she reached the sluggish current and dipped the first bucket, a low rumble echoed from the distant mountains. It wasn't thunder. It was a deeper, more menacing sound, a vibration she felt in the soles of her feet. She paused, listening. The rumble grew, a steady, hungry roar that seemed to be coming down the canyon. She straightened up, her heart beginning to pound a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The air, once still and stagnant, began to stir. A sudden cool wind whipped down the riverbed, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something wild. Sarah looked upstream. What she saw made the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't a rise in the river. It was a wall, a churning brown monster of water, logs and debris, unleashed by a cloudburst in the high country, was devouring the dry canyon. A flash flood. It was moving with impossible speed, a liquid avalanche thundering toward her. Panic seized her. She dropped the bucket and turned to run, but her boots sank into the soft mud that was already turning slick as the first tendrils of water reached her. The roar was deafening now. She stumbled, fell to one knee, and pushed herself up, her skirts heavy with mud. She was 100 yards from the safety of the bank, a distance that now seemed as vast as the entire territory. Jake had been about to turn his stallion back toward the open prairie when he heard it. The sound was unmistakable to any man who knew the land. He spurred his horse to the edge of the bluff overlooking the river, his eyes scanning the dry bed. He saw the girl, a splash of faded blue against the immense brown canvas, and he saw the wall of water coming for her. There was no time for thought, only a primal instinct that overrode years of self-imposed isolation. He kicked his feet free of the stirrups and launched himself from the saddle in a single fluid motion, hitting the ground running. He scrambled down the steep, crumbling bank, rocks and dirt skittering under his boots. "Run!" he roared, his voice nearly swallowed by the flood's fury. Sarah heard him, a human sound in the elemental chaos. She saw a figure charging down the bank, but her legs felt like they were mired in lead. She took another frantic step, and then the world exploded. The first wave hit her like a charging bull, knocking the air from her lungs and lifting her off her feet. The cold was a violent shock after the day's heat. She was tumbling, spinning in a world of brown water and blinding chaos. She couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs burned. Debris struck her, a glancing blow to her head that made stars burst behind her eyes. She was a rag doll in the jaws of a beast. Jake hit the water in a shallow dive, the force of the current immediately trying to rip him away. He was a strong swimmer, but this was like fighting a stampede. He fought to keep his head above the churning surface, his eyes desperately searching. He saw a flash of blonde hair. Then it was gone. He dove, kicking with all the power in his legs, pushing through the maelstrom. He surfaced, gasping, and saw her again, a few yards ahead, her body limp. With a final, desperate surge, he reached her. He hooked an arm around her chest, pulling her head above the water. She was unconscious, or close to it. The current was dragging them both downstream at a terrifying pace. The town was a mile away. They'd be smashed to pieces before they ever reached it. He needed to get to the bank, now. He angled his body, using the current's own power, kicking toward the nearest bank. His muscles screamed in protest. His lungs felt like they were on fire. The weight of the girl, her waterlogged dress, was an anchor trying to pull them both under. A large log cartwheeled past them, missing his head by inches. He held onto her tighter, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He would not let the river have her. He had lost too much to death already. His boots finally scraped against something solid, a submerged rock. He found a footing, the water still a powerful force trying to tear them apart. He pushed off, gaining a few precious feet. He did it again and again, fighting for every inch. He was in shallower water now, the current still strong but no longer a liquid death sentence. He half dragged, half carried her out of the main channel, stumbling through the sucking mud until he finally collapsed onto the grassy bank, pulling her with him. He lay there for a long moment, chest heaving, the roar of the river filling his ears. He rolled her onto her side, and she coughed, sputtering a torrent of muddy water. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with terror and confusion. They were the eyes of someone who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back at the last possible second. She pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her body shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. Her gaze fell upon him, this stranger, soaked and breathing as hard as she was, his face streaked with mud, his blue eyes holding an intensity that seemed to burn right through her. He had saved her. He had walked into the jaws of the river and pulled her out. In that moment, the world shrank to the few feet of muddy grass that separated them. The rigid rules of society, the polite distances between a man and a woman were washed away by the flood. There was only the primal, overwhelming reality she was alive because of him. Her life, which had been seconds from being extinguished, was now a gift he had given her, a debt that could never be repaid with coin or platitudes. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, breathless whisper, barely audible over the river's rage. It was a statement of fact, a truth, forged in the heart of the storm. "I belong to you." Jake stared at her, the words striking him with more force than the river. He saw no calculation in her eyes, only a profound, soul-deep sincerity. She wasn't offering a reward. She was ceding a life she no longer felt was her own. He felt the old instinct to retreat, to push her away, to ride off and leave this complication behind just as he had left everything else. But he couldn't. He saw the fragility in her. Yes, but beneath it, he saw the same stubborn resilience as the land itself, and more than that. He felt the sudden, crushing weight of responsibility settle over him. It was a feeling he had once known well, a phantom limb that had just begun to ache again. He could have said no. He could have told her she was talking nonsense, that it was just the shock. But in the stark clarity of the moment, with the scent of death still hanging in the air, a simple denial felt like a lie. In the unforgiving calculus of the West, a life saved was a life bound. He had intervened. He was now part of her story, and she, his. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his gaze never leaving hers. His voice was low and gravelly. "Yes." The ride to the Double M Ranch was a quiet, sodden affair. Jake retrieved his stallion, which had waited with the placid patience of a well-trained animal, and followed Sarah and her weary mare. The storm that had unleashed the flood had already passed over, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a world dripping and renewed. The air was cool and smelled of sagebrush and rain-soaked earth. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but dense, filled with the unspoken gravity of what had happened at the river. The 2 sentences they had exchanged her declaration. His acceptance hung between them, a contract written not in ink, but in the elemental forces of life and death. As they crested a low rise, the Double M came into view. It was easy for a man like Jake, who knew the language of the land, to read its story. The main house was sturdy, built of cottonwood logs by a man who intended to stay, but the roof needed patching and the porch steps sagged. The barn, though large, listed slightly to one side, and a section of its corral fence was a patchwork of mismatched timbers and wire. It was a place that had once been proud, but was now tired, clinging on by sheer force of will. It was a mirror of the girl riding ahead of him. An older man was seated on the porch, his left leg, thick with splints and bandages, propped up on a stool. His face was a roadmap of hardship, his beard shot through with gray, but his eyes, when they fixed on Jake, were sharp and wary. This was Elias Mackenzie, a man whose pride was as broken as his leg. "Sarah, what in blazes happened to you? You're soaked to the bone," he called out, his voice a gravelly rumble. He tried to stand, his hand reaching for a rifle leaning against the wall. his gaze never leaving the imposing stranger on the black horse. "It's all right, Pa," Sarah said, her voice still shaky. She slid from her horse, her movement stiff. The river, a flash flood. "This man, Mr. Thompson, he pulled me out." Elias's suspicion warred with a grudging gratitude. He sank back into his chair, the rifle still within reach. "Pulled you out, did he? Well, I suppose we're in your debt, stranger." The words sounded like they were scraped from the bottom of a dry well. "No debt," Jake said, his voice flat. He swung down from his stallion, his movements economical and sure. He looked at Sarah, then at her father. He was already caught deeper than he'd intended. The girl had brought him home, and in her mind, this was now where he belonged. A grim irony twisted in his gut. He, who had no home, was now tied to this failing one. Over the next few days, Jake settled into a routine that felt both foreign and painfully familiar. He took one of the empty stalls in the barn for his horse and a bedroll in the hayloft for himself. He didn't ask. It was simply understood. Sarah tended to her father, cooked their meager meals, and worked the ranch with a quiet, relentless determination that made Jake's chest ache. He saw the way she mended harnesses with hands that should have been doing needlepoint, the way she hauled buckets of water until her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. And he began to understand the full scope of their trouble. It wasn't just the drought or the broken leg. The real poison was human. He heard it first in the tense, hushed conversations between Sarah and her father when they thought he was out of earshot. Words like a pressure, cut fences, and a name Morrison. One evening, as Jake was reshoeing Sarah's mare, Elias hobbled out to the barn, leaning heavily on a crude crutch. "You handle a horse well," Elias observed, his tone less hostile than before. "I've known a few," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "This land, this ranch, it's been in my family for 2 generations, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have the best water rights in this valley. That's the crux of it, the real trouble." Jake hammered a nail home, the sharp metallic sound punctuating the silence. He waited. "Frank Morrison and his crew." Elias spat the name like a curse. "They're not just rustlers. They're vultures. They want this land. They've been running off my stock, a few head at a time, cutting my fences so my cattle wander off, trying to bleed me dry so I'm forced to sell for pennies on the dollar." Jake looked up then, his blue eyes locking with the older man's. He saw desperation, but also a core of unyielding defiance. "Why hasn't the sheriff done anything?" Elias let out a bitter laugh. "Sheriff Miller. He's a good man, but he's outmatched. Morrison has a dozen hard cases riding with him. Miller has 1 deputy and a healthy dose of self-preservation. He rides out, finds no proof, and tells me to be careful." The story was a common one in the West, a tale of might making right. But as Jake listened, a cold dread began to creep up his spine. It resonated with a dark chapter from his own past, a past he thought he had buried in the mountains of Colorado. 5 years ago, the name wasn't Morrison, it was Cole. Marcus Cole, a man who owned a silver mine, a bank, and half the politicians in the state. He was a king in all but name. And his son, a sneering, arrogant brute named Ethan, acted with the impunity of a crown prince. Jake had been in a town called Silver Creek, minding his own business, building his own ranch into a thriving success. He had a wife then, Eleanor, and a son, little Sammy. The memory was a physical pain, a phantom limb that ached with a cold he could never escape. One afternoon, he'd seen Ethan Cole and 2 of his cronies cornering a young girl in an alley behind the saloon. She couldn't have been more than 12, a stable-hand's daughter. They were laughing, backing her against a wall, their intentions sickeningly clear. Something in Jake, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed in such a ferocious degree, had snapped. He hadn't thought. He'd just acted. It was over in seconds. He'd laid out the two cronies with his fists. But Ethan, drunk and enraged at being challenged, had pulled a gun. Jake had been faster. The gunshot echoed in his memory. A deafening crack that had sealed his fate. He hadn't murdered the boy. He'd defended himself and the girl. But that wasn't how Marcus Cole saw it. In his grief and rage, Cole had used his immense wealth and influence to paint Jake as a cold-blooded killer. He'd put a price on Jake's head, a bounty large enough to make a man betray his own brother. The fire had come a week later. A lamp accidentally knocked over in his barn in the middle of the night. He'd woken to the smell of smoke and the terrified screams of his horses. He'd gotten Eleanor out. But when he went back for Sammy, the roof had collapsed. He'd lost everything. His son, his home, his life. He never knew for sure if it was Cole's men, but in his heart, he was certain. He had fled, leaving his wife with her family, promising to send for her when it was safe, a promise he knew he could never keep. He'd become a ghost, a drifter with a heavy wallet and a haunted soul, forever looking over his shoulder. Now, listening to Elias Mackenzie, he saw the same pattern, a powerful man using thugs to take what he wanted. He felt an unwelcome pull, a dangerous sense of empathy for this broken family. He was being drawn into their orbit, and every instinct screamed at him to run. His presence here was a liability. If anyone connected Jake Thompson, the wealthy rancher, to the wanted man from Colorado, they would bring a hellfire down on the Double M that would make Morrison's harassment look like a Sunday picnic. Staying here wouldn't just endanger him, it would endanger Sarah. The thought of bringing that kind of violence to her doorstep was sickening. He owed her a life, not another tragedy. Sarah, for her part, refused to be a fragile doll he had rescued. She began to watch him, her brown eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and intense scrutiny. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet confidence that spoke of deep competence. She saw the skill in his hands when he repaired the corral fence, his work neat and strong. She saw the way he calmed her mare with a soft word and a gentle touch. She was beginning to see the man, not just the savior. One afternoon, she found him in the barn, cleaning his revolver with meticulous care. The weapon looked deadly and efficient in his hands. "You know how to use that," she stated. "Not a question, but an observation." "It's a necessary skill out here," he said, not meeting her eyes. "My father taught me to shoot," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "I'm a fair shot with a rifle, but I've never had to point it at a man." "Let's hope you never do," he said, the finality in his tone closing the conversation. But Sarah was persistent. She didn't want his protection as a gift. She wanted to earn her own safety. "Will you teach me?" she asked, her chin tilted up in a challenge. "To be faster, better." Jake finally looked at her. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. This wasn't the terrified girl from the riverbank. This was a woman preparing for a war. Saying no would be an insult to her spirit. Saying yes felt like loading a gun and handing it to someone he was trying to shield from a gunfight. "There's more to a fight than being fast," he said gruffly. "It's about staying calm, knowing when to fight and when to run." "I'm not running," she said fiercely. "This is my home." Her words were a direct hit, striking the very core of his own shame. He was a man defined by running. Her courage was a stark contrast to his own calculated retreat from life. He found himself tangled in a web of contradictions. He was drawn to her strength, yet that very strength was what made him want to protect her, and the only way to truly protect her was to leave. That evening, he watched as she stood on the porch, staring out at the vast, star-dusted prairie. The moonlight softened the weary lines around her eyes, illuminating the quiet grace he was beginning to see in her. He felt a stirring of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 5 years, a dangerous, treacherous warmth. He was becoming attached, not through duty or debt, but through a genuine admiration and a growing, unwelcome affection. The ghost of Marcus Cole felt closer than ever, a shadow stretching all the way from Colorado. Jake knew what he should do. He should saddle his stallion before dawn and disappear, becoming a ghost once more. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he looked at Sarah, standing as a lone sentinel guarding her dying home, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The part of him that had died with his son in that fire stirred with a reluctant, painful life. He was a man caught between two impossible choices: to stay and risk destroying her, or to leave and abandon her to the wolves. For now, he chose to stay, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his past was riding hard to catch up with him. Word of the rescue on the Redemption River traveled faster than a prairie fire, in a place like Frontier, where lives were measured in seasons of drought and hardship. An event of such dramatic life and death proportions was a feast for the gossip-starved populace. When Jake Thompson rode into town a week later, with Sarah Mackenzie on her mare beside him, the town's silent observation was as loud as a gunshot. They had come for supplies, a necessary trip that Jake had insisted he make alone. Sarah, however, had been adamant. "It's my ranch, Mr. Thompson, my list of needs. I'm not some china doll to be hidden away on a shelf," she'd said, her chin set with that familiar stubbornness he was coming to recognize. He hadn't argued, though every instinct told him to keep her away from the prying eyes of the town. As they dismounted in front of the general store, the whispers started. They were like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, words half caught and carried away. "Pulled her from the floodwater himself. Saw it with my own eyes. Carried her out like she weighed nothing. Mackenzie's girl owes him her life. She does." Inside the store, Martha Gable, the proprietor's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, offered them a thin, tight-lipped smile. "Sarah, dear, so good to see you on your feet," she said, her eyes flicking to Jake, who stood near the door, a tall, silent shadow. "And Mr. Thompson, the whole town is talking. Such a heroic thing you did." The word heroic was coated in a syrupy sweetness that failed to hide the sour judgment beneath. Sarah felt a hot flush of color creep up her neck. She understood the unspoken implication in Mrs. Gable's tone. It was the same look she'd seen in the eyes of men on the street, a look that assessed her not as a person, but as a prize that had been won. The declaration she had made at the river, a raw and honest admission of a life debt, was being twisted by the town into something else entirely, a crude transfer of ownership. She didn't just owe him her life. She belonged to him. "Mr. Thompson was a godsend." "Martha," Sarah said, her voice clear and firm, forcing the woman to meet her gaze. "We're all very grateful." While Sarah gathered flour, salt, and beans, Jake felt the weight of other stares. These were not from the women, but from the men loafing by the Cracker Barrel. Their looks were different, a mixture of suspicion and a grudging respect for his apparent wealth and quiet competence. He was an outsider, a man who had appeared from nowhere with a fine horse and money to spend. Whispers about him were darker, more speculative. "Heard he came from up Colorado way." "Some kind of trouble, I'd wager. A man like that doesn't just appear. Looks more like an outlaw than a rancher to me." The words were barbs that found their mark in Jake's oldest wounds. They were too close to the truth. He was a fraud, a ghost, hiding in plain sight. This attention was dangerous. It was a spotlight that could attract the very wolves he had spent 5 years running from. He kept his expression impassive, his hand never far from the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit so ingrained it was like breathing. Every moment spent in this town felt like he was standing on a trap door, waiting for the floor to fall away. His gaze drifted to Sarah. He watched her stand a little straighter under Martha Gable's scrutiny, her pride a shield against the town's gossip. A fierce, protective instinct flared in his chest, so potent it startled him. He wanted to sweep her out of this place, away from their whispers and judgments, back to the isolation of the Double M, where the only dangers were the ones he could face with a gun. But he was the biggest danger of all. He was the source of the trouble that hadn't yet arrived. The conflict festered inside him. The more he was around her, the more he saw her resilience, her quiet courage. The deeper the treacherous feeling of affection grew. He found himself watching her hands as she kneaded dough, admiring the way she coaxed a few stubborn vegetables from her small garden, listening to the soft cadence of her voice when she spoke to her father. These small, domestic moments were like ghosts of the life he had lost, and they filled him with both a profound longing and a paralyzing fear. To protect her, he built a wall. He became quiet, almost curt. He took his meals after she and her father had eaten, spoke only when necessary, and threw himself into the physical labor of the ranch with a feverish intensity. The double M became his penance. He repaired the sagging porch, reshingled a section of the house's roof, and rebuilt the corral fence until it was as straight and strong as a fortress wall. He was pouring his own desperate need for structure, for a home, into the wood and nails of hers. The ranch was a symbol of everything he could never have again: family, tradition, roots planted deep in the earth. By fixing it, he was trying to mend the broken pieces of his own past. Sarah felt the distance he created between them as keenly as a winter chill. One day he was the man who had held her life in his hands, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. The next, he was a polite but remote stranger who shared her land. It hurt more than the town's gossip. She was developing feelings that went far beyond gratitude. She was drawn to the sadness in his eyes, the capable strength in his hands, the profound stillness that seemed to surround him. She wanted to know the man, not just the hero, but every time she tried to breach the wall, he would retreat further. "You work too hard, Mr. Thompson," she told him one evening, bringing him a dipper of cool water as he finished setting a new gatepost. "There's work to be done," he replied, his voice rough. He took the dipper, careful not to let his fingers brush against hers, and drank deeply. "My father and we can't pay you for all this," she said softly. "I haven't asked for pay," he said, handing the dipper back and turning his attention back to the post, his broad back a clear dismissal. Her frustration mounted. She was not a debt to be worked off. She was a woman, and she was beginning to realize, with a feeling that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying, that she was falling in love with this enigmatic, haunted man. A few days later, Elias insisted they ride out to the north pasture to check on the small herd that Morrison's men hadn't yet managed to steal. "With this new grass from the rain, they might wander," he'd said. "Best to keep an eye on them." The ride took them past the Redemption River. It had receded, now a placid, silver ribbon flowing peacefully through the wide, muddy scar it had carved. It was hard to believe this was the same monstrous force that had nearly claimed her. For Sarah, the river was a boundary line in her life. On one side was the girl she had been frightened, overwhelmed, and alone. On this side was someone new, someone who had faced death and chosen to live. It was a place of rebirth. For Jake, the river was the place his carefully constructed solitude had been breached. It was a symbol of his entanglement, of a fate he could no longer outrun. They rode in silence for nearly an hour. The only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the damp earth. The prairie was vast around them, an empty stage where their small, personal drama felt both insignificant and intensely focused. The air was thick with unspoken words. They found the cattle grazing peacefully in a small, box canyon. As they were turning to leave, Sarah's mare, a usually sure-footed animal, stepped on a patch of loose shale hidden by the new grass. The horse gave a startled cry as its foreleg twisted, and it stumbled violently. Sarah was thrown. It happened so fast she had no time to cry out. The world tilted, a blur of green grass and blue sky. She braced for the impact, for the hard, unforgiving ground, but it never came. Jake moved with a speed that seemed supernatural. He was out of his own saddle and on the ground in a single, fluid motion. Closing the distance between them in 2 long strides, he caught her, his arms wrapping around her waist, breaking her fall and pulling her tight against his chest. The impact was a soft jolt, not against the earth, but against the solid wall of his body. Her face was pressed against the rough cotton of his shirt, and she could feel the powerful, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The scent of him leather, dust, and clean male sweat filled her senses. For a long, suspended moment, the world stopped. There was no ranch, no gossip, no ghosts from Colorado. There was only the circle of his arms, the feeling of his strength surrounding her, holding her safe. He held her a second longer than was strictly necessary, his grip firm and sure. The wall he had so carefully constructed between them had crumbled to dust. Sarah tilted her head back, looking up into his face. His blue eyes, usually so distant and guarded, were blazing with a raw, unguarded emotion, a fierce concern that stole her breath. She saw it all in that one look, the man he was, the man he tried so hard not to be. The spell was broken by Jake. A shudder came down over his eyes, and the guard was back in place. He loosened his grip and gently set her on her feet, his expression becoming a stony mask.
"Are you hurt?"
His voice was hoarse, rougher than he intended.
"No,"
she whispered, her own voice trembling slightly. She was shaken, not from the fall, but from the raw intensity of the embrace. "I'm fine." He didn't seem to hear her. He turned away abruptly, moving to her mare, running a practiced hand down the horse's trembling leg. "Just a slight sprain," he announced, his focus entirely on the animal.
"She'll be all right if we walk her back slow."
He used the task to rebuild his wall, brick by painful brick. He didn't look at her again. The ride back to the Double M was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was no longer a silence of distance, but one of crackling, undeniable connection. Sarah now knew with absolute certainty that her feelings were not just gratitude, and Jake rode with the grim realization that his heart was a far greater traitor than any bounty hunter. The fire he thought had been extinguished 5 years ago had not died. It had merely been sleeping, and Sarah Mackenzie had just fanned the embers back into a dangerous, flickering flame. The electric tension that had followed Jake and Sarah back from the North Pasture settled over the Double M like a low-hanging cloud. For 3 days, they moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. The wall between them was back up, but now they were both acutely aware of it, and of the fragile, explosive emotions it was holding back. The work of the ranch continued, a steady rhythm of chores that was the only thing keeping the silence from becoming unbearable. The first sign of the coming storm was not a thunderclap, but a whisper. Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch, his face etched with a weary concern that did little to inspire confidence. He accepted a cup of water from Sarah, but refused to dismount, as if he couldn't afford to linger.
"Elias, Sarah."
He nodded, his gaze falling on Jake and staying there.
"Just wanted to give you a neighborly warning. Frank Morrison's back in the territory, and he's got some new men riding with him. Hard-looking types."
"He's always got hard-looking types," Elias grumbled from his chair on the porch. "This is different." The sheriff insisted. "Word is, he's been asking questions over in Frontier, questions about a stranger, a man with a fine black horse and money in his pocket." He looked pointedly at Jake's stallion, which stood regal and out of place in the dusty corral. "He's also been heard mentioning a name, Marcus Cole." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. It was as if the sheriff had reached into his chest and squeezed the air from his lungs. 5 years. 5 years of looking over his shoulder, of sleeping with one eye open, and the past had finally caught up to him on a struggling ranch in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a coincidence. Frank Morrison wasn't just a common land grabber. If he was connected to Cole, he was a different kind of predator altogether. He was a man with resources, reach, and a direct line to the powerful enemy who wanted Jake's head. The bounty. That was the missing piece. Morrison wasn't just trying to squeeze the Mackenzies out. He was hunting bigger game. The double M was the bait, and Jake was the prize. After the sheriff left, a heavy, suffocating silence descended. Sarah looked at Jake, her eyes filled with a dawning horror. "Marcus Cole, who is that?" Jake's face was a grim, unreadable mask. "He's no one you need to know about," he said, his voice flat and cold. "This has nothing to do with you or your father." "The hell it doesn't," Elias snapped, slamming his fist on the arm of his chair. "That sheriff just laid it out plain. Morrison is after you, and he's using my ranch to get to you, which is why I'll be leaving," Jake said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was the only logical choice, the only way to protect them. He had to run, to draw the trouble away with him. "I'll ride out tonight." "No," Sarah said, stepping in front of him, blocking his path to the barn. Her fear was palpable, but beneath it was a bedrock of sheer, unyielding resolve. "You can't. That's what he wants. If you run, he'll still take this ranch. He'll just have no reason to be careful about it. We'll be left alone to face him." "She's right," Elias said, his voice low. "Running now just signs our death warrant." Jake was trapped. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to do what he had done for 5 years, survive. But looking at Sarah's defiant face, he saw a different kind of survival, a kind he had forgotten, the kind that drew a line in the dirt and refused to be moved. Leaving them now felt like a betrayal deeper than any bounty hunter's treachery. The attack came 2 nights later. It came without warning, under the sliver of a crescent moon. Jake was in the hayloft, sleep eluding him as always, when the ranch dogs erupted in a frantic, terrified chorus of barking. It was a sound of panic, not of warning. He was on his feet in an instant, his Colt in his hand, moving toward the loft door. Below, he heard a splintering crash, followed by the lowing of cattle. Sharp and panicked, he peered out. In the dim moonlight, he could see them, at least a dozen riders, dark shapes on dark horses, moving with a swift, brutal efficiency. They had shattered the new corral gate and were driving the last of the Mackenzies' herd out onto the prairie. A light flickered in the main house. Elias shouted something, his voice thick with sleep and alarm. Jake saw Sarah appear in the doorway, a long rifle in her hands. "Get back inside," Jake roared from the loft. Gunshots answered him, not aimed to kill, but to intimidate. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, the bullets thudding into the log walls of the house and the barn. The riders let out whoops and hollers, their voices cruel and mocking. At the edge of the group, one man sat taller in the saddle, observing the chaos with a calm detachment. Frank Morrison. Even in the dark, his presence radiated a cold, reptilian authority. Jake fired back, not wildly, but with a cold, measured aim. He aimed for the horses, for the ground in front of them, trying to spook them and break the charge. One rider's horse screamed and reared, throwing its owner to the ground. The others only laughed. Their work already done. The cattle were gone. But they weren't finished. One of the riders wheeled his horse around, a lit torch in his hand. He galloped toward the barn, the one Jake had spent weeks repairing. "No!" Sarah screamed, raising her rifle. The rider tossed the torch through the open hayloft door. It landed on a pile of dry hay not 10 feet from where Jake stood. The effect was instantaneous. The hay ignited with a hungry whoosh, and a wall of flame roared to life. Smoke and searing heat filled the enclosed space. Jake scrambled for the ladder, his lungs already burning. Outside, Sarah fired her rifle. The torch-wielding rider cried out and clutched his shoulder, his horse bolting into the night. But the damage was done. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, the dry old timbers of the barn acting as perfect kindling. Morrison and his men, their message delivered, melted back into the darkness, their mocking laughter echoing behind them. Jake dropped the last few feet from the ladder, coughing, his eyes streaming. The barn was already an inferno, flames licking up the walls and pouring through the roof. Sarah and Elias were trying to get the horses out of their stalls, their faces illuminated by the horrific, dancing light of the fire. "The house, get the buckets to the house," Jake yelled, his voice raw. They had to keep the flames from spreading. For the next hour, they fought a desperate, losing battle. They were 3 people against a raging fire. They managed to save the 2 horses. But the barn, the symbol of the ranch's heart, was a lost cause. They could only watch as the roof finally collapsed inward with a deafening groan, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night sky. As the first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. The corral was empty. The barn was a blackened, smoldering skeleton of its former self. A thick, acrid smoke hung in the air, a funeral shroud over the dying dream of the Double M Ranch. Elias Mackenzie sat on his porch steps, his head in his hands, a broken man. All the fight seemed to have drained out of him, leaving only a hollow shell of despair. But Sarah was not broken. She stood before the smoldering ruins, her face streaked with soot and tears, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle. Her expression was not one of defeat. It was one of cold, hard fury. The fire had burned away the last of her fear, leaving behind something as hard and sharp as tempered steel. She turned to look at Jake, her eyes burning with an intensity that matched the flames. "He will not have it," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. "This is our home. My father built it. My mother is buried on that hill. I will not let that man burn it all to the ground and take what's left. I will die here first." In that moment, Jake saw it all with a terrible, piercing clarity. He saw the ashes of his own barn in Colorado. He saw the ghost of his son in the smoke. He saw the same ruthless evil that had destroyed his life now poised to destroy hers. He had 2 choices, clear and stark as the devastation around them. He could run. He could saddle his stallion, ride away from this ruin, and disappear back into the shadows. It was the sensible choice, the choice he had made every day for 5 years. He could save himself and leave them to their fate. Or he could stay. He could stand on this scorched piece of earth and fight. He could face Morrison. He could face the bounty. He could face Marcus Cole and the ghosts of his past. Staying meant probable death, and it meant putting Sarah in the line of fire. But running now felt like a different kind of death. It was the death of the last decent piece of his soul. It was abandoning another family to the fire. He looked from the smoking ruins of the barn to the unyielding fire in Sarah's eyes. His choice was made. The years of running were over. The ghosts had finally cornered him. And here, on this broken-down ranch, beside this unbreakable woman, he would finally turn and face them. He walked over to her, taking the heavy rifle from her hands. His gaze was steady, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an oath. "You won't die here," he said, "and you won't fight him alone. This fight, it's mine now, too." The morning after the fire, the sun rose on a landscape of ash and despair. But Jake's decision had ignited something in the ruins, a tiny, defiant spark of hope. His words, "This fight, it's mine now, too," had transformed him from a guest into a bulwark. He was no longer just a man staying at the Double M, he was a man defending it. He gathered Sarah and a grim-faced Elias on the porch of the main house, the only structure left fully intact. He spoke with the calm, direct authority of a man who had led men before. "Morrison has the numbers," Jake stated, his voice devoid of any comforting illusions. "He thinks he's already won. He's driven off your cattle and burned your barn to break your spirit. He expects you to be packing a wagon right now." He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle. "We're not going to do what he expects. We're not going to defend. We're going to attack." Elias stared at him, incredulous. Attack with what, a broken-legged old man, a girl, and 1 gunman against a dozen. "I'm not just 1 gunman. Jake said quietly. And I have friends, or I hope I still do. He looked at Sarah. I need to ride out. I'll be gone for 2, maybe 3 days. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the fear that he was using this as an excuse to run after all. He held her gaze, his own expression unwavering. I will be back, Sarah. I give you my word. She searched his face for a long moment, then gave a single, firm nod. Be careful, Jake. Jake rode north, pushing his stallion hard. He bypassed towns and kept to the high country, his movements guided by a map of memory from a life before Colorado. He was heading for the Cimarron Valley, a place of rugged, self-sufficient folk who didn't take kindly to bullies like Frank Morrison. He was looking for the Wilson homestead. He found it nestled in a defensible box canyon, a sturdy log house with smoke curling from its chimney. As he approached, 3 figures emerged onto the porch, rifles held in a way that was ready but not overtly hostile. They were lean, weathered men, from a grizzled patriarch with a flowing white beard down to a youth who couldn't be much older than Sarah. That's far enough, stranger, the old man called out. It's been a while, Abel, Jake said, pulling his horse to a halt. The old man squinted, his eyes widening in recognition. By God, Jake Thompson, I thought you were a ghost. Abel Wilson had known Jake in the early days, before the wealth, before the tragedy. He knew him as an honest, hard-working man who was dangerously fast with a gun. Over coffee and chicory, Jake laid out the situation, leaving out the personal details of his past, but painting a clear picture of Frank Morrison's land grab and his brutal tactics. Abel listened, stroking his beard. When Jake was finished, he looked at his 3 sons. There was Caleb, the eldest, 25, with his father's steady eyes and a thoughtful, quiet demeanor. There was Levi, a few years younger, lean as a whip, whose hands seemed to rest naturally near the pistols at his hips. And finally, Eli, 19, with a fiery spark in his eye and the restless energy of a colt. This ain't our fight, Pa, Caleb said, though his tone was more questioning than declarative. A man like this Morrison, if he takes the Mackenzie place, he won't stop there, Abel said, his voice a low rumble. His kind of greed is a sickness that spreads. And Jake Thompson once stood by me when I didn't have 2 cents to my name. We pay our debts. He looked at his sons, a silent order passing between them. The Wilsons will ride with you, Jake. When Jake returned to the Double M with the 3 Wilson brothers in tow, it was as if a fresh wind had blown through the valley, clearing away the smoke and despair. Their presence, their quiet confidence, their well-oiled rifles, their 4 extra horses was a tangible sign that the odds had shifted. Hope, which had been a fragile ember, now felt like a steady flame. The ranch was transformed into a military camp. Plans were drawn in the dirt. Weapons were cleaned and oiled until they gleamed. The Wilson boys, raised on the harsh frontier, were masters of their craft. Caleb was a natural strategist, seeing the lay of the land in terms of sight lines and choke points. Levi was a marksman of terrifying skill, able to hit a silver dollar from 100 yards. Eli was the scout, a phantom on horseback who could move through the country without leaving a trace. From the beginning, Sarah refused to be sidelined. While Jake and the Wilsons planned their strategy, she stood with them, listening intently. You should stay in the house when the time comes. Sarah, Jake said one afternoon, his tone that of a man trying to protect something precious. No, she replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. All 4 men looked at her. You need another rifle. You need someone who knows every rock and ravine in this valley. I know where a man can hide and where he can be trapped. I know the land better than any of you. I am not a liability, and I will not be treated as one. Levi, the quiet one, looked skeptical. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but this is rough work. Sarah didn't argue. She simply walked to the makeshift firing range they had set up, picked up her rifle, and took aim at a row of tin cans placed on a fence post 70 yards away. She fired 5 shots in quick succession. 5 cans jumped into the air. She reloaded, her movements practiced and sure, and looked back at them. Eli let out a low whistle. A slow smile spread across Levi's face. "All right," Caleb said, nodding with newfound respect. "Tell us about those ravines." From that moment on, she was one of them. She trained with them, her stamina and resolve earning their respect. She rode with Eli, pointing out hidden trails and springs. She practiced reloading her rifle under Caleb's tutelage until she could do it in the dark. Jake watched her, a complex storm of emotions churning inside him. He was astonished by her strength, a strength he had sensed but never seen so clearly. He was proud of the way she held her own, the way the Wilson boys had stopped seeing her as Mackenzie's girl and started seeing her as an asset, a fellow soldier. But his pride was mingled with a deep, gnawing fear. Every skill she mastered was a skill she might need to use to save her life. Every step she took toward becoming a fighter was a step deeper into the violence he had brought to her door. He found himself teaching her, his hands sometimes brushing hers as he adjusted her grip on a pistol, the contact sending a jolt through them both. In those moments, the soldier and the protector in him were at war. The camaraderie of their small army grew around the nightly campfires. They shared stories, Eli's boisterous and funny, Caleb's thoughtful, Levi's rare but insightful. For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of belonging, of shared purpose. He saw Sarah laugh at one of Eli's jokes, a genuine, unguarded sound, and the tightness in his chest eased for a moment. He was seeing the woman she was meant to be, not just the one hardship had forced her to become. One night, after a long day of tracking the movements of Morrison's lookouts, the camp grew quiet. The Wilsons had turned in, exhausted. Elias was asleep in the house. Only Jake and Sarah remained by the fire, staring into the mesmerizing dance of the flames. The air was cool and crisp, and the stars overhead seemed close enough to touch. "You were a leader before, weren't you?" Sarah asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Jake didn't look at her. "A long time ago," he said, his voice low. "In another life." "You blame yourself for this," she stated. It wasn't a question. "For the barn, for Morrison." He finally turned to look at her, the firelight carved shadows and highlights on her face, making her look both strong and vulnerable. "It is my fault, Sarah. My past followed me here. I put you and your father in danger." The confession was a weight lifted, but it left him feeling raw and exposed. She shook her head, her expression earnest. "My father and I were already in danger. We were losing. We were being bled dry, waiting for the end. You didn't bring us danger. Jake!" She leaned forward slightly, her brown eyes holding his, refusing to let him look away. "You brought us a chance." The simple sincerity of her words disarmed him. He had been so focused on the trouble he represented that he hadn't seen the hope he had inspired. She moved a little closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel the warmth radiating from her. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a sound meant only for him, a secret shared in the vast, dark prairie. I don't just need a protector. Jake." He watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't know what she was going to say, but he knew it would change everything. "I need a partner." The word hung in the air between them, imbued with all the weight of the West. A partner. Not a hired gun, not a savior, not a guardian. An equal. Someone to stand beside, to face the world with. It was a declaration of a different kind of belonging, not born of debt, but of choice, of respect, of love. Jake felt his defenses, the walls he had spent 5 years building, crumble into dust. The ghosts of his past, of his wife and son, of Marcus Cole, all seemed to recede, pushed back by the fierce, gentle light in her eyes. He wanted to reach for her, to tell her that he felt it too, that this connection was the first real thing he had felt since the fire. He wanted to tell her yes, but the words wouldn't come. The old fear, the certainty that he was a plague, that he would only bring her pain, still held his tongue in a vice. He couldn't promise her a future when his own was a question mark written in blood. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw it all. She saw the fierce battle raging within him, the hesitation, the fear, the crushing weight of his past. But she also saw something else, something that finally broke through the surface, raw and undeniable. She saw the carefully controlled dam of his emotions break, and a look of such profound, aching love flooded his gaze that it left her breathless. It was a complete and total surrender, more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It was a vow made in silence, witnessed only by the fire and the stars. The unspoken vow by the fire changed the air at the Double M. The strategic planning took on a new urgency, no longer a matter of defense, but of grim necessity. The quiet moments between Jake and Sarah were now charged with a shared, unspoken understanding. They were partners, and a storm was coming. It was Eli Wilson, with his keen eyes and restless energy. Who brought the news? He rode into the ranch yard at a gallop, his horse lathered and breathing hard, his young face taut with excitement and gravity. "They're moving," he announced, swinging down from his saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "The whole crew. They've gathered the Double M cattle and are pushing them east, toward the flats. Looks like they're heading for the railhead at Redemption Creek to sell them off." This was the moment they had been waiting for. It was a brazen, arrogant move by Morrison, a final act of plunder before, presumably, finishing off the Mackenzies. But it was also a mistake. By moving the herd, he was exposing his entire force on open ground. Caleb unrolled a crude, hand-drawn map on the porch table. "The flats are a death trap for us," he said, his finger tracing a line. "No cover. But to get there, they have to pass through Weaver's Pass." Sarah stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the map. "Weaver's Pass is too wide. They could spread out, but 3 miles south, there's a wash the locals call the Needle's Eye. It's a narrow, rocky cut through a series of low mesas. The walls are steep. They'll have to drive the herd through single file." She looked up, her eyes meeting Jake's. It's a perfect ambush. A grim consensus settled over the small group. The Needle's Eye would be their battleground. They rode out under the cover of dusk. A small, determined band of 5 against a force of more than a dozen. They moved like ghosts through the twilight, their path guided by Sarah's intimate knowledge of the land. They reached the cut hours before dawn and set up their positions under a canopy of brilliant stars, the silence of the prairie amplifying the pounding of their hearts. Caleb and Levi, the marksmen, took the high ground on the northern ridge, finding natural snipers' nests in the rocks that gave them a clear view of the entire wash. Jake, Sarah, and Eli concealed themselves on the southern side, closer to the entrance of the pass, hidden in a dense cluster of boulders and juniper. Their job was to initiate the attack and sow chaos, driving Morrison's men into the kill zone prepared by the brothers on the ridge. As the sky began to bleed from black to a bruised purple, they heard it, the distant, low sound of a large herd on the move. The ground began to vibrate faintly. The tension in the air became a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Jake gave Sarah's shoulder a quick, firm squeeze. She looked at him, her face pale in the pre-dawn light but her eyes steady, and gave a sharp, determined nod. Morrison's gang rode with a lazy confidence. 2 outriders came first, followed by the main body of the herd, pushed along by the rest of the gang. Frank Morrison himself rode near the back, a cigarillo clamped in his teeth, his posture relaxed. They were cowboys, not soldiers, and they ambled into the Needle's Eye without a hint of caution. Jake waited until the bulk of the herd was inside the narrow pass, a river of brown hides and horns. He raised his Winchester. The first shot was the signal. He aimed not for a man, but for the sheer rock face above the outriders, the bullet struck with a sharp crack, sending a shower of rock chips down onto the men below. All hell broke loose. Eli and Sarah opened fire from the boulders, their rifles adding to the deafening roar that echoed off the canyon walls. From the ridge above, Caleb and Levi's rifles began to speak with deadly precision. A rider at the front of the herd clutched his chest and toppled from his saddle. Another's horse screamed and went down, trapping its rider beneath it. The cattle, terrified by the noise, panicked. The herd became a massive, churning weapon of confusion, stampeding backward, crashing into the riders behind them. Morrison's men, caught completely by surprise, were a tangled mess of shouting men and panicked animals. Jake fired with a cold, detached efficiency. There was no rage, no fear, only a singular, lethal focus. Every movement was economical, every shot deliberate. He was a maestro, conducting an orchestra of chaos. He saw a man trying to rally a few others and fired, the man's hat flying from his head as he spun to the ground. He saw another trying to get a clear shot at the ridge and dropped him with a single round from his Colt. The skills he had honed over a lifetime, the skills that had brought him so much pain, were now a terrible, beautiful instrument of retribution. The air grew thick with gun smoke, a gray, acrid fog that burned the eyes and throat. The canyon amplified the symphony of violence, the crack of rifles, the boom of pistols, the ricochet of lead off stone, the screams of men and the terrified bellows of cattle. Through the haze, Jake saw Frank Morrison trying to restore order. The man was no coward. He roared commands, firing his own pistol toward the ridge, trying to provide cover for his men to retreat. He was the head of the snake. Jake knew that if he could take Morrison down, the fight would be over. He moved from the cover of the boulders, working his way along the canyon wall, trying to get a clearer shot. He was so focused on Morrison, on the cold calculation of wind and distance, that he didn't see the rider who had dismounted and scrambled up a small, hidden game trail on Jake's own side of the canyon. The man rose from behind a rock outcropping not 30 yards away, his pistol leveled at Jake's exposed back. "Jake!" Sarah's scream cut through the din. She had seen the movement. She had anticipated it, knowing the trail was there. There was no time for her to aim her rifle. The man was too close, his target too clear. Jake spun, his Colt coming up, but he was too late. The man's pistol flashed. But it was not Jake who felt the impact. Sarah, without a second's hesitation, had thrown herself forward. She didn't fire. She slammed her body into Jake's, knocking them both to the ground behind a low rock shelf. The bullet that would have taken Jake in the spine whizzed through the air where he had been standing a half-second before, lying on the hard ground, with Sarah's weight on top of him. The world momentarily shrank to the scent of her hair and the frantic beating of her heart against his. He looked up into her face, her eyes wide with adrenaline and fierce determination. She had saved him. The moment was shattered as the gunmen above them fired again, the bullet smacking into the rock beside their heads. Jake reacted instantly, pushing Sarah behind him and firing his Colt twice over the top of the rock. The man above cried out and disappeared from view. The tide of the battle had turned. Morrison's men were broken, scattering, trying to flee the canyon of death, but the fight was not yet over. From the ridge above, Eli Wilson let out a triumphant whoop. He had been fighting with a youthful, almost joyful ferocity. Seeing the enemy retreat, he made a fatal mistake. For a split second, he stood up from behind his cover to get a better shot at a fleeing rider, silhouetting himself against the brightening sky. Frank Morrison, turning his horse for one last look at the chaos, saw him. The outlaw leader's face was a mask of cold fury. He raised his rifle in a single, fluid motion. The shot was long, almost impossible, but Morrison was a predator. The report of his heavy-caliber rifle was distinct, a deep boom that cut through the lighter crackle of the other guns. On the ridge, Eli froze. A small, dark stain appeared on his chest. He looked down at it, a look of surprise on his young face. Then his legs buckled, and he collapsed behind the rocks. Eli Caleb's anguished roar was a sound of pure agony, a sound no one on the prairie that day would ever forget. The fight went out of them. The remaining outlaws fled, Morrison with them. No one fired a shot to stop them. A sudden, profound silence fell over the Needle's Eye, broken only by the mournful lowing of a few wounded cattle and the wind whistling through the rocks. Jake and Sarah scrambled up the ridge. They found Caleb kneeling, holding his younger brother in his arms. Levi stood beside them, his face ashen, his body rigid with a grief so profound it seemed to have turned him to stone. Eli was gone. The fiery spark in his eyes was extinguished forever. The victory was complete, but it tasted of nothing but ash. They had won back the herd. They had broken Morrison's gang. But the cost was written in the blood of a 19-year-old boy staining the hard, unforgiving rock of the West. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the smoke-filled canyon and the grim aftermath of the battle, a long, dark shadow of sorrow fell over them all. It was the shadow of reality, a stark reminder that in this land, every victory, every sunrise, was paid for at a terrible price. The ride back from the Needle's Eye was a silent, solemn funeral procession. They had retrieved the cattle, which now ambled behind them, a hollow victory. Eli Wilson's body was draped over his own horse, led by his brother Caleb. The silence of the three remaining men was a thing of stone, heavier and more profound than any words of grief. Sarah rode beside Jake, the adrenaline of the battle replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She had saved the man she loved, but a boy she had come to respect as a friend was dead. The stark, brutal arithmetic of the West offered no comfort. When they arrived at the Wilson homestead to deliver the terrible news, Abel Wilson met them at the gate. The old man looked at the grim faces, at the horse carrying his youngest son, and his weathered face seemed to crumble, all the years of hardship crashing down on him at once. He didn't speak. He simply walked to his son's side, placed a trembling hand on the still form, and stood there, a statue of silent, fathomless grief. The sight was a knife in Jake's soul. This was his doing. This was the price of his past. Back at the Double M, the weight of what had happened was a physical presence. Caleb and Levi were hollow-eyed and silent, their grief a cold, simmering rage. They spoke of hunting Morrison down, of finishing what was started. But Jake knew it couldn't be that way. More fighting would only mean more graves. The cycle of violence had to be broken, not just continued. That night, sleep was an impossibility. Jake sat on the porch, staring into the darkness, the ghost of Eli Wilson beside the ghost of his own son, Sammy. Both were boys cut down too soon because of him. The fire in Colorado, the gunfight in the canyon, they were two ends of the same bloody thread, and he was the one holding it. He had spent 5 years running from a shadow, only to cast it upon others. His decision by the fire to stay and fight had been a half measure. Now, there was only one way to truly end it. He had to face the darkness not from the cover of rocks, but in the open. He had to face Frank Morrison, and through him, the ghost of Marcus Cole and all the running he had ever done. The next morning, as the sun cast long shadows across the yard, Jake made his announcement. He was cleaned up, his face shaved, and he wore his gun belt strapped low and tied to his thigh. "I'm riding into Frontier," he said, his voice calm and resolute. "I'm going to finish this with Morrison." "We're coming with you," Caleb said instantly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Levi nodded, his eyes like chips of flint. "No," Jake said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This isn't your fight anymore. Your family has already paid a price no one should have to pay. This is between me and him." "He killed my brother." Levi's voice was a raw, ragged sound. "I know," Jake said, meeting his gaze. And that blood is on my hands. I brought him here. I brought this trouble to your door. Atoning for that is my burden to carry, not yours." He looked at Sarah, who stood frozen, her face a mask of terror. "I'm asking you, as a friend, to stay here with your father. Protect Sarah. Please, let me end this my way." "Your way is going to get you killed," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. She stepped toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "Don't do this, Jake. We can leave. We can all leave. Go somewhere he can't find us." He reached out and gently took her arm. "Sarah, I've been running for 5 years. Look where it's gotten me. Look what it's cost, Eli. There's no place to run to where the past won't find you. The only way out is through." He saw the tears welling in her eyes, and his own heart ached. "I have to do this." His resolve was absolute. It was the calm of a man who had accepted his fate, whatever it might be. The Wilson brothers, seeing the iron in his eyes and understanding the grim honor that drove him, finally, reluctantly, agreed. The ride into Frontier was surreal. The morning was brilliant, the sky a vast, unforgiving blue. But as Jake rode down the town's single dusty street, it was as if he brought a pocket of night with him. Windows were shuttered, doors were quietly closed. The usual morning bustle of the blacksmith, the general store, the livery, had vanished. The town held its breath, a silent, unseen audience to a play they knew would end in blood. Frank Morrison was in the saloon. Jake could feel his presence. He reined his stallion to a halt in the center of the street, the sun hot on his back. The world was utterly silent save for the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze. "Morrison!" Jake's voice was not a shout, but a clear, carrying command that cut through the silence. "Get out here!" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open. Frank Morrison stepped out onto the boardwalk, followed by 2 of his remaining men. He was holding a bottle of whiskey, and a sneer was fixed on his face. "Thompson," he drawled, his voice thick with arrogance. "I figured you'd have the sense to be halfway to Mexico by now." "This is between you and me," Jake said, ignoring the men behind him. "One-on-one. Let's finish it." Morrison laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in no position to be making demands." "Your men can watch," Jake said, his voice dangerously soft. "But if either of them makes a move, they're dead, and you know it." Morrison studied Jake's face. He saw no fear, no doubt. He saw only the cold certainty of a man who had already made his peace with death. Morrison's own pride, stung by the defeat at the Needle's Eye, would not allow him to refuse. To have his men shoot Jake down would be a coward's victory. He handed the bottle to one of his thugs. "All right, Thompson," he said, stepping down into the street. "Your funeral." The 2 men faced each other across 30 yards of sun-baked dust. The space between them crackled with a lethal energy. This was more than a gunfight. It was a collision of 2 worlds. Morrison, the predator who took what he wanted through brutality. Jake, the ghost forced to reclaim his life through that same brutal currency. Jake saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the man in front of him, to the slight shift of Morrison's shoulders, the way his hand hovered over the butt of his gun, the memories, the fire, Sammy's face, Eli collapsing on the ridge. They weren't a distraction. They were fuel. They sharpened his focus to a razor's edge. Morrison went for his gun. He was fast, a blur of motion born of a dozen dirty fights. But Jake was faster. His hand was a streak of lightning. The Colt revolver seemed to leap into his grasp. There was no conscious thought, only pure, lethal instinct honed over years of survival. His gun cleared the holster a fraction of a second before Morrison's. The 2 shots were so close together they sounded almost like one, a single, deafening explosion that shattered the town's silence. A red flower bloomed on Frank Morrison's chest. The sneer on his face was replaced by a look of profound, final surprise. He stumbled backward, his gun falling from his numb fingers, and collapsed into the dust. Jake stood, unmoving, the smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt. A wave of profound, weary relief washed over him. It was over. The running was done. Then, a sharp, searing pain exploded in his left side. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading across his shirt, just above his hip. Morrison's dying shot had been true. His strength left him in a sudden rush. The world tilted, the bright blue sky spinning. He dropped to one knee, his gun falling into the dust beside him. His hand pressed against the burning wound. The silence was broken by a frantic, heartbroken scream. "Jake!" Sarah. She had followed him. He saw her running toward him from the end of the street, her face a blur of panic and love. The Wilson brothers were right behind her. The town's doors began to creak open, the citizens emerging like prairie dogs from their burrows to witness the aftermath. Sarah fell to her knees in the dust beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, afraid to touch it. "Oh, God, Jake!" she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. He looked up at her, and through the haze of pain, he offered a weak, tired smile. The fight was over. The shadow had been faced. As Sarah held him, her tears falling onto his dusty shirt, the brilliant morning sun shone down, cutting through the lingering wisps of gun smoke. The dust kicked up by the duel began to settle, clearing the air. It was as if the world itself was being washed clean, in the middle of the street, bleeding in the arms of the woman he loved. Jake Thompson felt not an end, but a painful, terrifying, and beautiful beginning. He had been reborn in a crucible of violence, and for the first time in 5 years, he was no longer a ghost. The chaos in the dusty street of Frontier coalesced around the kneeling figures of Jake and Sarah, the townspeople who had watched the deadly drama from behind their curtains, now emerged, their fear slowly being replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. They had not just seen a gunfight, they had witnessed a reckoning. They saw Frank Morrison, the bully who had long preyed on their fears, lying still in the dust. And they saw the stranger, Jake Thompson, bleeding but victorious, having faced him down in a fair fight, a code the West understood even if it seldom practiced. Sheriff Miller was the first to push through the gathering crowd, his face a mixture of relief and professional concern. "Someone get Doc Adams," he bellowed. Caleb and Levi Wilson were already there, their rifles held loosely, their expressions a somber mixture of grief for their brother and a newfound, profound respect for the man who had avenged him. They stood guard, a silent, formidable perimeter around Jake and Sarah, their animosity toward Morrison's men shifting to a protective stance over their new ally. Doc Adams, a man whose hands were as skilled at patching up bullet holes as they were at delivering babies, worked with a grim efficiency right there in the street. He cut away Jake's shirt, his pronouncement a mixture of bad news and good. "The bullet went clean through, missed the bone, thank the Lord, but he's lost a lot of blood. He's a strong man, but the next few days will tell the tale." The journey back to the Double M was a world away from the somber ride from the Needle's Eye. A makeshift litter was fashioned, and the Wilson brothers, along with several men from the town who had quietly volunteered, carried Jake with a gentle reverence. It was a hero's procession. Sarah walked beside him, her hand resting on his, her face pale but her spirit a fierce, protective flame. She had almost lost him twice, once to the river, and once to a bullet. The world had tried to take him from her, and she had refused to let it. The days that followed were a quiet testament to healing, both of body and spirit. Sarah became his constant nurse, her presence a soothing balm against the fever and pain. She cleaned and dressed his wound, spoon-fed him broth, and sat by his bedside through the long, fever-haunted nights, her touch a constant, reassuring anchor in the darkness, in those quiet, vulnerable hours. The last of Jake's walls were washed away. He would wake from a fevered dream of fire and smoke to find her hand on his forehead, her soft voice murmuring that he was safe, that he was home. News from the town trickled in. Morrison's gang had scattered to the four winds, leaderless and broken. The bounty on Jake's head, it seemed, had died with the man who was actively hunting it. The townsfolk, led by Sheriff Miller, had rounded up the Double M's scattered herd and driven them back to the ranch. A wagon arrived one morning with donations from the general store, sacks of flour, coffee, and medical supplies. Another day, the blacksmith arrived with 2 of his sons and a load of fresh timber. "Figured you'd be looking to rebuild that barn," he'd said gruffly, avoiding eye contact in the way of men unaccustomed to expressing kindness. "A man needs a good barn." Soon, a small community was at work, Caleb and Levi, their initial raw grief having settled into a somber resolve, threw themselves into the work with a silent intensity. They were not just rebuilding a structure, they were honoring their brother's sacrifice. They were building something new from the ashes. Elias Mackenzie, hobbling on his crutch, directed the work with a renewed vigor, his pride in his ranch restored, his gratitude toward Jake immeasurable. As Jake's strength returned, he would sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and watch the new frame of the barn rise against the blue sky. He watched Sarah moving among the men, directing them with a quiet confidence, her spirit the undeniable heart of the entire endeavor. He saw not just the girl he had saved, but the woman she had become, a leader, a survivor, a partner. One evening, a week after the gunfight, the fever had broken for good. The air was cool, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Sarah sat in a chair beside his bed, her head nodding with exhaustion. Jake watched her, a profound, aching love filling his chest. He had brought so much darkness to her life, and she had met it with nothing but light. He knew he could not let another day pass without giving her the whole truth. He owed her that. He owed it to himself. "Sarah," he said, his voice raspy but clear. Her eyes fluttered open. "Jake, you're awake. Do you need some water?" "No," he said, reaching out and taking her hand. His was still weak, but his grip was firm. "I need to talk. I need you to listen." He told her everything. He started with a life she couldn't imagine, a life of wealth and family in Colorado. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, a good woman he had loved, and he spoke of his son, his voice breaking as he described Sammy's laughter and the little wooden horse he used to carry everywhere. Then the story turned dark. He told her about Marcus Cole, a man whose power was as vast and unforgiving as the mountains themselves, and about his son, Ethan, a cruel boy who mistook arrogance for strength. He recounted the incident in the alley, the fight, the gunshot that had echoed through the last 5 years of his life. He spared no detail, including the awful certainty in his heart that Cole's men had set the fire that took his son and destroyed his world. The bounty wasn't just for a killing, Sarah, he confessed, his eyes searching hers, expecting to see fear, or worse, pity. It was for defiance, for embarrassing a powerful man. "I ran. I left my wife behind, and I ran. I've been running ever since. That's who I am. A ghost. And that's the trouble that followed me here. It got Eli Wilson killed. It almost got you killed." He finished, the long-held poison of his past finally spent. The room was silent, the only sound the chirping of crickets outside. He had laid his broken soul bare before her, and he waited for the verdict. He expected her to pull her hand away, to get up and walk out of the room, out of his life. The danger wasn't gone. Marcus Cole was still out there, a sleeping dragon who could one day wake. Sarah didn't pull her hand away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his. She looked at him, and there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unwavering compassion that shook him to his core. She saw his pain, his guilt, his shame, and she was not afraid of it. "You're not a ghost, Jake Thompson," she said, her voice soft but imbued with an unshakable strength. Ghosts don't rebuild barns. They don't face down killers in the street for other people's families. And they don't fight for a home. She leaned closer, her free hand coming up to gently cup his cheek. I know about Marcus Cole. I know the danger might not be over, but I also know what my life was before you came. It was a slow death. It was fear of Morrison, fear of the drought, fear of losing everything. Fear is a prison. She looked directly into his eyes, her own shining with unshed tears, but her voice was as clear as a bell. I'm not going to live in that prison anymore. I choose you. I choose the man who saved my life, who fought for my home, who showed my father how to hope again. I choose love, not fear. A month later, the new barn stood tall and proud, the scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the smell of hay. The ranch, though scarred, was alive. The cattle were fattening in the pastures, and the lifeblood of the Double M was flowing once more. That evening, as a spectacular sunset painted the western sky in the hues of orange and deep purple, Jake and Sarah stood on the porch, leaning against the rail. He was still healing, a slight limp the only reminder of the gunfight, but his eyes were clear and peaceful for the first time in 5 years. He looked at the ranch, at the symbol of their shared struggle and triumph. And then he looked at her. The setting sun caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. She was the most beautiful, resilient thing he had ever known. She turned to him, a soft smile on her lips. She thought back to that terrifying day by the river, to the desperate, breathless words she had spoken. They had been true then, in their own way, but they meant something entirely different now. She reached out and took his hand, her heart in her eyes. I belong to you, she said, her voice a quiet, heartfelt whisper. It was not a statement of debt, but a declaration of unity, a gift freely given. Jake's heart, which he thought had been broken beyond repair, felt whole. He smiled, a genuine soul-deep smile that reached his clear blue eyes. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Yes, he answered, his voice thick with an emotion he would never again run from. And I belong to you. They stood together, two survivors, partners against the harsh beauty of the West, watching the last light fade and waiting for the stars to appear, ready to face whatever new dawn would bring, together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.